If there's one geographical feature that's defined global conflict in 2026, it's maritime choke points. In March, in response to US attacks on Iran, Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz, a vital trade choke point between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. And last month, the Houthis, an Iranian-backed rebel group in Yemen, also closed the Bab-al-Mandab, a narrow waterway connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, which Saudi Arabia had been using as a workaround for the Strait of Hormuz. This elevation of choke point disruption as a tactic in regional and global conflicts has forced countries to look at their supply chain vulnerabilities to protect their import and export routes. One leading actor here is China, which has this week begun using a new shipping route over the Arctic dubbed the Ice Silk Road. This route, controlled by Russia, runs along Russia's Arctic coast from eastern China to the UK, avoiding both the Bab-al-Mandab and China's own critical maritime choke point, the Strait of Malacca. So in this video, we'll explain China's reliance on the Strait of Malacca, its Arctic Silk Road plan, and whether it can work. Trump has always loved criticising China. But between his first and second presidency, we'd argue he's lost his advantage. You can read how we think Beijing turned the tables on Trump in the latest issue of our magazine, Too Long. That's just one of the articles in our longest issue ever. Subscribe to get your copy by clicking the link in the description. To understand this story, you need some background on critical maritime choke points. We actually made a video on this a few months ago, so you should check that out too. But essentially, ships carry more than half the world's trade by value and around 85% by volume. The world's two most important maritime choke points are the Strait of Hormuz, a 33-kilometre wide passage between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman, through which 20% of the world's oil and gas used to pass, until Iran closed it during the war, and the less discussed Strait of Malacca, a waterway connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. For context, the Strait of Malacca stretches between the Indonesian island of Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, with Singapore at its southern tip. As such, it's vital for maritime trade between East Asia and the Middle East, Africa and Europe, with around 17 million barrels of oil a day passing through the Strait of Malacca, slightly less than the Strait of Hormuz pre-war. As a massive exporter of goods and the world's biggest importer of Iranian oil, China is especially dependent on the Strait of Malacca, with 2/3 of all Chinese maritime trade and roughly 80% of China's oil imports passing through it. The strait also serves as China's main export route to global markets, with virtually all container ships departing from China's eastern ports in Shanghai, Shenzhen, Ningbo and Guangzhou passing through it to reach Europe, the Middle East and Africa. As such, China's reliance on the Strait of Malacca has left it vulnerable to a potential naval blockade. In 2003, Chinese President Hu Jintao actually described the situation as the Malacca Dilemma, saying that, quote, certain powers have encroached on and tried to control navigation through the strait. Here, Jintao was presumably alluding to the US, which could technically try to blockade the strait via its naval forces in the Indo-Pacific to cut off China's energy imports, although this is highly unlikely, given any blockade of Malacca would simultaneously hurt the economies of America's regional allies, including Japan, South Korea and Singapore. Anyway, given the recent closure of two major Middle Eastern choke points, the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab-al-Mandab, through which Chinese exports to Europe pass, Chinese shipping firms have been looking for alternative routes that are less exposed to geopolitical conflict. For years, China has been considering an Arctic route known as the Northern Sea Route, or NSR, which skirts Russia's northern coast to hedge against disruption in the Strait of Malacca. Until recently, shipping restrictions due to polar ice meant the NSR only played a marginal role in Chinese trade, and wasn't viewed as a viable alternative to the strait. But in recent months, given the disruption to both the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab-al-Mandab, the NSR has drawn renewed attention, with melting polar ice freeing up new shipping lanes and making the journey from China to Europe shorter and more viable. Now, this brings us to China's Ice Silk Road. This week, Chinese shipping line Sea Legend has launched a new Arctic shipping route, dubbed the Ice Silk Road, running from Ningbo on China's east coast to Felixstowe in the UK. This is the first ever regular container shipping service through the Arctic, cutting the usual 40-day shipping time between China and the UK in half, and avoiding the geopolitical risks associated with other choke points. So, how will this new Ice Silk Road work? Well, according to the Financial Times, the Northern Sea Route, as it's officially called, is made up of 28 different sections with guidelines set by the Russian-controlled NSR administration. Rosatom, the Russian state-controlled energy company, issues permits to sail through the area, meaning only Chinese vessels or those from Russia-friendly or neutral countries are allowed to pass through. Because of EU sanctions on Rosatom, as well as the logistical risks and associated insurance costs involved in transiting through icy Arctic waters, European commercial vessels will likely avoid the route. For China, however, the NSR offers a 30 to 40% reduction in voyage distances compared with the traditional Suez Canal route. For context, trade from China to Europe mostly passes through the South China Sea via the Strait of Malacca, across the Indian Ocean, through the Bab-al-Mandab, and then the Suez Canal to the Mediterranean. The average transit time from China to Europe via this southern route is about 35 to 45 days. By contrast, via the Ice Silk Road route, this drops to just 20 to 25 days, with the Bering Strait being the sole choke point. Given that the remote Bering Strait is much less of a geopolitical hotspot than, say, the Red Sea, this essentially offers China unobstructed shipping access into the Arctic Ocean, from where it can use a trade corridor entirely controlled by its ally. However, there are also major downsides. The most obvious are the operational and safety risks. The Arctic weather is volatile and dangerous, with sudden storms and shifting ice causing potential delays and unpredictability. And there's also a risk of vessels getting stuck with no search and rescue teams nearby. Moreover, a lack of icebreaker facilities, with Russia's production of new icebreakers failing to keep up with rising demand for commercial transit through the NSR, means safe passage is restricted to the summer months when the ice melts. It's also more expensive, given Chinese ships have to pay transit fees for Russian icebreaker escorts. Finally, the NSR can't fully replace the Strait of Malacca given the volume of trade that passes through the strait, and the fact it's a year-round option. That said, China seems to have calculated that the long-term strategic independence offered by this new Arctic Silk Road outweighs its liabilities. As the rate of polar ice melting accelerates over the coming decades due to human-induced climate change, and China ramps up production of its own heavy icebreakers, China is well placed to eventually transform the Arctic into a reliable year-round shipping route, albeit one that remains legally under Russian sovereign control. Now, this story about China's Ice Silk Road is constantly updating as more and more outlets are reporting on it, so it might feel like it's hard to keep up with the ever-changing media landscape. Right now, there are 25 sources currently reporting on it, with most of the coverage coming from the right. This type of analysis is why Ground News has been our favourite way to stay up to date with the news since 2023. It's no secret by this point just how much we're fans of Ground News. They've been long-time supporters of this channel and independent news media at large, and truly help us understand the political climate better. For example, without Ground News, we wouldn't be able to easily compare the headlines for this story on China's Ice Silk Road, and see that the left is framing it as the first scheduled freight service to the North Pole, and the right is focusing on the avoidance of shipping choke points. Ground News not only gives you an easy way to digest the news, but it also offers a comprehensive breakdown into the ownership, bias distribution, and factuality of each article, allowing you to dive even deeper. If you're worried about how much you can trust what's being said about a specific story, with a click of a button you can filter and sort every story by their factuality level, helping you to easily grasp the reliability of each outlet. And with their blind spot feed, you're able to see everything you might not normally stumble across, both local and international, keeping you fully informed even outside of your media bubble. Ground News is completely algorithm free, so you're never forced into a narrative or told how or what to think. That's why we're partnering with them to offer you 40% off their unlimited access Vantage plan. All you have to do is subscribe through the link in the description, go to ground.news/TLDR or scan the QR code on screen, and you'll be supporting an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.